Rocco de Marco felt contentment ease into his bones as he took in his surroundings. He was in a beautiful room in a world-renowned museum, right in the heart of cosmopolitan London. It had been designed by a famous French Art Deco designer in the 1920s and drew aficionados from all over the world to see its spectacular stained glass windows. The crowd was equally exclusive. High-ranking politicians, erudite commentators, A-list celebrities, and billionaire philanthropists who controlled the world's stock markets with a flick of a finger or the raising of a brow. He was in the latter category, and at the age of 32 was surrounded by hushed and awed speculation as to how he'd achieved his untouchable status in such a short space of time. At that moment, he caught the eye of a tall, elegant patrician blonde across the room. Her glossy hair was pulled back into a classic chignon, and her haughty blue gaze warmed under his look. He did notice, however, that not a tinge of real colour came into those carefully rouged cheeks. She was dressed head to toe in shimmering black, and he knew that she was as hard as the diamonds at her throat and ears. She smiled and raised her glass to him in a small but significant gesture. A sense of triumph snaked through Rocco as he raised his glass in a mirror salute. The prospect of wooing the immaculately bred and oh-so-proper Miss Honora Winthrop flowed like delicious nectar through his veins. His gut clenched hard. This moment was it. He was finally standing at the pinnacle of everything he'd fought so hard for. Never had he dared to imagine that he would be in such a position, hosting a crowd such as this, contemplating becoming an indelible part of it. He was finally standing far enough above and away from the degradation of his young life in the slums of a poor Italian city where he'd been little more than a feral child, with no way out. He'd been spat upon in the street by his own father, and he'd watched his half-sisters walk past him without a single glance at their own flesh and blood. But he had clawed his way out, with guts and determination and his infamous intelligence. And to this day, no one knew of his past. He put his empty glass on the tray of an attentive, hovering waiter and declined another one. Keeping his wits about him was as ingrained in him as a tattoo on his skin. For a second, he thought of the crude tattoo he'd borne for years until he'd had it removed. It was one of the first things he'd done on his arrival in London almost 15 years ago, and his skin prickled now at the uncomfortable reminder. He shrugged it off and went to stake his claim on Miss Honora Winthrop. For a brief second, a sense of claustrophobia rose, but he clamped down on the sensation. He was where he wanted to be, where he'd fought to be. Composing himself, and irritated that he felt the need to do so, he found his eye snagged and caught by a lone figure, a female figure. He could see immediately that she was not half as polished or alluring as the other women in the room. Her dress was ill-fitting, and her hair was a long, wild tangle of vibrant red. It suggested that there was something untamed about her, and it called to him on some deep level. Rocco's mind emptied of its original purpose. He couldn't look away from the enigmatic stranger. Before he had even registered his intent, he'd veered off course and was moving in her direction.